Welcome. I'm Christina Johnson, the president of The Ohio State University. And this evening's event is the second in a series designed to realize Ohio State's motto, education for citizenship, in the wake of the January 6th assault on our nation's capital. I know that we're all grateful for the peaceful transition of power that we witnessed, which is the hallmark of American democracy, in the inauguration of President Joe Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris, which took place yesterday. Last week, Dr. James Moore III, our Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion and Chief Diversity Officer, led a fantastic conversation about fostering deliberative democracy in this era of political polarization. And tonight, with a program titled Becoming Weavers in a Divided Nation, we address the divisions in our country from a different angle, at the level of social interactions and the fraying relationships within communities. It's not just in our national politics that distrust among people with different ideologies, backgrounds, and experiences leads to destructive outcomes. During this pandemic, nearly every locality has had its share of residents who are unconvinced that they have an obligation to protect their neighbors by following basic public health guidelines. And we've paid a high price for that. We've had so much scorching evidence of racial injustice this year, and it's become clear, to quote, whether it's Angela Davis or Ibram Kendi, that the opposite of racism and racist isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. If we are not fighting discrimination on our daily rounds, we're tolerating a society in which the quality of our neighbors' lives depends on the color of their skin. We live in cities and towns with increasing deep economic divides, which means that even if they share the same zip code, those with higher education degrees and those without them sometimes seem to live in different worlds. What can we do about alienation, social isolation, and the sense that there is no common ground to be defended? During this extremely difficult year, Buckeye Nation has come together to learn and to care for each other. And I am so proud of this community. Tonight, we will consider the experiences of the weavers among us and ways to apply their ideas to the wider communities around us. Can kindness conquer all? Can optimism conquer all? Put me in the camp of those who believe it can. I'm delighted that we'll be hearing tonight from New York Times columnist David Brooks, who founded the Aspen Institute's Weave Social Fabric Project to celebrate those weavers who change the world through relationships, forging community connections with love and generosity. First, however, we have a wonderful program curated by the Moritz College of Law's Divided Community Project, which, like the Weave Project, was founded to address those divisions that tear at the fabric of American communities. Applying its expertise in mediation and dispute resolution to communities facing deep division and community unrest, the Divided Community Project believes in the values of listening and empowerment, and in finding community spirit, or those shared aspirations that pull people together. Tonight's speakers are very appropriately stitched together from across the Ohio State community, including faculty, staff, and students in Columbus, in Mansfield, and abroad. I want to thank all of them in advance for inspiring us to do more in our own lives, to find common ground with others, and to build relationships across divides. I want to turn now to this evening's facilitators. Henry Wu of the Ohio State class of 2020, joining us from the University of Oxford, where he is a Rhodes Scholar. And Julia Siebertson, a second-year law student, and Carl Smallwood, a double Buckeye, and Bill Froelich, leaders from the Divided Community Project. They will lead a program that I suspect will not only open our eyes, but also our hearts. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to Henry and Julia.
Thank you, President Johnson, and for your insightful remarks. It's an honor to be here with all of you this evening as we discuss ideas to weave communities together. I'm Henry Wu, and along with Julia Siebertson, we will be your guides for the first half of tonight's session.
That's right, Henry. Before we introduce our first speakers, we want to acknowledge that weaving might be challenging in this current political moment. I know that I've felt like I've been on a roller coaster during this election cycle and during this summer's advocacy for Black lives. Further, I know many have felt isolated by COVID and politics. We know that many of you have a friend, roommate, family member, classmate, or colleague who has a different political orientation, a different faith, or who, put simply, looks different than you. Weaving in this moment presents an opportunity to connect with our neighbors and to develop deep, meaningful relationships, to make deep connections, and become curious with all of those around us. We hope you leave tonight's conversation with ideas to weave communities together and build social fabric. Tonight's event will take place in 3 stages. First, 9 diverse faculty, staff, administrators, and students from across the OSU community will share quick ideas for weaving. Second, in about 35 minutes, Carl Smallwood and Bill Froelich, leaders from the Divided Community Project, will lead a short conversation highlighting themes from today's conversation. They will also attempt to address some of the comments and questions raised in the Q&A function here in Zoom. Finally, New York Times columnist and founder of the Aspen Institute's Weave the Social Fabric project, David Brooks, will deliver inspirational remarks to conclude tonight's event.
Thanks, Julia. Before we begin, let's quickly identify a couple of ground rules for tonight's conversation. So first, Ohio State is recording and will post this conversation on the Education for Citizenship website. During the first part of this conversation, feel free to use the Q&A session. And finally, we will launch a couple of similar polls, just like this one, to engage all of the participants. For example, please take this quick poll to let us know if you are a student, grad student, administrator, staff member, faculty member, alumni, parent, or friend of OSU. In the next 35 minutes, you'll hear ideas for weaving from 9 speakers. We'd like you to write down ideas that resonate with you. Later this evening, we will ask you to commit to implementing at least one weaving idea in the weeks ahead. Julia, are we ready to get started?
Yes, I think we are.
Okay, so let me introduce the first 3 speakers and their topics. We will kick off with OSU Mansfield Dean and Director Norman Jones, who will focus on turning the focus to what we all share. Then we will hear from our first student, second-year dental student, David Campbell, who will discuss the value of mentoring. And third, Lena Tenney, formerly of the Kirwan Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and now serving as inaugural director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Pharmacy, will share her perspective about how to seize opportunities to remind acquaintances that a democratic nation such as ours will not work for anyone until it works for everyone. Dean Jones.
Thanks so much, Henry and Julia. It's an honor to be part of this special event, and I'm really grateful to all of you who have joined us for it. I'm the Dean and Director of the Mansfield campus, where we support the university's mission of making Ohio State's world-class education available to all Ohioans. It's a mission I love, and part of that mission includes supporting our local communities. So last May, after George Floyd was murdered and our communities mourned and struggled over how to respond to the issues of racial injustice raised by the murder, I got involved alongside other community members. I joined in a peaceful protest and was inspired by the diverse people who came together for that. But I also saw that there were many people not represented at that gathering. And I knew our community would not be able to grow and keep getting better if we remained so fragmented and fractured. So I started reaching out to community leaders who had not joined in the protests, having quiet one-on-one conversations beyond the glare of the public spotlight. My ability to have those types of conversations is a tremendous privilege. Not everyone has the same opportunities, so I don't mean to suggest that others need to follow my example. I just want to tell you about what I learned from these conversations. I'll come back to that in a second, but first I want to talk about our topic this evening, becoming weavers in a divided nation. Some friends of mine have warned in recent days that we need to be careful about describing our nation as divided. They say that word can imply that there are only two sides to the political issues we face, which isn't true, and that the real truth must be somewhere in the middle of two sides, which also isn't necessarily true, and that being urged to find common ground implies that we should give equal respect even to violent extremists. I understand their feelings. I cannot agree with people who believe violence has a legitimate role in civil discourse and democratic debate. I also understand why one might reject the possibility of finding common ground with extremists. At the same time, in my experience, most people are not extremists. And indeed, one of the things I learned from my quiet conversations with community leaders over the past year is that we tend to imagine each other as extremists in ways that are just often not true. I believe, in fact, that this tendency is one of the biggest problems we face. Common ways of talking about political divisions in the US tend to conjure the metaphor of two sports teams, each one on a side of a playing field, one blue, the other red. A better image might be a Venn diagram where various circles represent coalitions of people around different issues, or the metaphor of weaving, which suggests that a complex tapestry can represent our political differences and connections. That, in a nutshell, is what I learned from my conversations with elected officials and other community leaders in 2020. When we set aside the reductive metaphor of opposing sports teams and just had a conversation, we saw how much we really do share in common. I found that we shared far more understanding, compassion, and acknowledgement of racial injustice in our country than the sports team's metaphor would allow. And the values we shared illuminated new possibilities for creating more productive dialogue and building toward a fuller realization of our ideals. I'm looking forward to learning more about this kind of work from others this evening, and I thank you for taking the time to listen to my story. And now I'll turn it over to David Campbell.
Thank you. At the age of 11, my mother took me to my dentist. Sorry, I'm having technical difficulty. Give me a second, I'm sorry. At the age of 11, my mother took me to a new dentist. His practice was near the public housing community we lived in at the time. As I sat in the dental chair, she said, "This man takes care of all of these people and it's just him. Can you imagine doing that?" I couldn't at the time. Where I grew up, only a few type of people made it: rappers and athletes. I remember my dentist going from room to room happy, and I wanted that too. He was doing so much for so many people in my community. I used basketball as my ticket into college. Fortunately, my father convinced me to develop an alternative plan in case I got injured. I went back to that moment with my mother, and I walked over to shadow my dentist. The time I spent in his office changed my life. While in college, I wanted to give back to my community and share what I learned during my journey. So I tutored my former basketball team, and I also assisted a neighbor working to earn a GED and tutored high school students in Mississippi who were eager to learn science and mathematics. In addition to that, on my return home, I joined my cousin and joined his Free Thinkers Collective and assisted in providing students with tools to go to school with and also clothes. From these experiences, I understood that in order to shape a community, you have to share what life gives you to inspire and give hope and value to others. Even when people may think less of themselves, showing them love and how to pursue goals can go a long way. My dentist opened my mind to the opportunities that I couldn't see in myself. I brought others along and urge you to share your skills with those that need it most. After the injustices perpetrated against Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, I joined a group of 5 students and wrote a letter to the College of Dentistry's administration in the need to increase diversity in a historically underrepresented profession. The dean responded and formed a diversity, equity, and inclusion group. To date, we have a working mentorship program. We also have a public statement on racism and several other action items for the year. My journey weaving in the communities is fulfilling a purpose that is bigger than myself. Because if you don't do it, then who will? I'm often reminded of a quote that I use as my North Star. You can lead the people if you don't love, you can't lead the people if you don't love the people. And you can't save the people if you don't serve the people. Thank you. On to you, Lena.
That was beautiful, David. Thank you so much. So much of the work of weaving actually depends first upon creating a space for all the weavers. One of the resonating messages of the summer of 2020 was the chant, "No justice, no peace." It rang through our streets and for many of us, our hearts. The idea behind that phrase is simple yet complex. We cannot have peace in a society without first having justice. We cannot weave together our threads of difference without first having equity. So if injustice is present, society is not at peace. The unstated question for hundreds of years has been, peace for whom and at whose expense? When we refuse to address underlying issues such as racism, homophobia, classism, etc., we refuse to allow our society to weave together the threads of peace. When we decide to maintain an unequal status quo that we did not create, but that we did inherit, we decide to let marginalized individuals and communities continue to be marginalized so that those who are comfortable with the status quo do not have to deal with the discomfort of change. In other words, indeed, the words of Ohio State alum, Dr. D.L. Stewart, quote, "Inclusion asks, is this environment safe for everyone to feel like they belong? Justice challenges, whose safety is being sacrificed and minimized to allow others to be comfortable maintaining dehumanizing views," end quote. We will not always agree as we decide how to weave together, but we can all agree that every weaver is worthy of human dignity and respect. This work in preparation for the weaving process requires not only acknowledgement of or apologies for stratification in society, but concrete action that eliminates that stratification. So to use an analogy from the civil rights movement, quote, "If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, that's not progress. If you pull it out all the way, that's not progress. The progress comes from healing the wound that the blow made," and that is from Malcolm X. So let's acknowledge the knives. Let's pull the knives out completely, and let's work to heal the wounds of not only division, but also injustice instead of pretending it isn't there. We simply cannot have a thriving society without addressing these deep wounds. So how do we seize the opportunity to share this idea with those around us, this idea that a peaceful society first requires the presence of justice? First, we can recognize that the personal is the political. Recognize that these conversations are not purely intellectual, they're also emotional. We must hold space for emotionality in our dialogue because these issues are not simply reducible to intellectual or theoretical exercises. They affect real lives. Secondly, we can refuse to simply agree to disagree on issues of human rights and social inclusion specifically. So agreeing to disagree is totally appropriate for contentious but ultimately relatively insignificant matters, such as the question of does pineapple go on pizza or is a Pop-Tart a ravioli, which might be the most contentious thing said thus far in the event. But it's not appropriate for fundamental questions like who should have access to the opportunity to survive and thrive in our society. Finally, we can have the courage to speak up when we experience or witness injustice. I'll refer you to the work on being an active bystander, also known as Did They Really Just Say That? By the Kirwan Institute for practical tips about how to do so. I'll leave you with this final thought. Ask yourself not only what kind of weaver you want to be, but also what kind of tapestry you want to be weaving and contributing to. We are all at our best when we set our goals high and strive not only for discussion across difference, but actual cooperation toward a better society for all. Thank you, and I will turn it over to Julia.
Thank you, Lena. What a great start to this evening's conversations. Let's hear from 3 more campus leaders. First, we will hear from Jacqueline Mishimaya, Associate Vice Provost for Diversity and Inclusion, who will share ideas for celebrating what is important to others. Then Robert Soto, an undergraduate student in journalism, will share his 3 keys for weaving while leading. Third, Terry Murphy, co-director of the Conflict to Peace Lab at the Mershon Center for International Security Studies, will discuss cross-stitching different individuals around problem solving to help build stronger relational elasticity. Let's turn to you, Vice Provost Mishimaya.
Thank you, Julia. I appreciate that. So let's talk about why we should celebrate others and become weavers. So let me start with some stats. We have 7.8 billion people in the world. The UN recognizes 193 independent countries. There are 6,500 languages spoken worldwide. We have 4,300 identified religions around the globe. The USA has 382 million people. There are 574 federally recognized indigenous tribes within the United States. The United States has 50 states. Ohio has 88 counties. And in autumn 2020, the enrollment for The Ohio State University was at 67,957. 505,000 of those students were foreign. 4,174 self-identify as having disabilities, and 1,085 are veterans. Now, those stats are very telling. They tell us that there are millions of reasons for all of us to recognize and celebrate others. And they also highlight why it's important to become weavers in this world. But how do we do this? We reach out, we take chances, we really get to know people who are different than ourselves. I say to you, dare yourself to engage with others in a deep and vulnerable way. Don't worry about making mistakes or saying the wrong thing. I promise you, when you take those chances and you venture out, it's going to change your life. And I've done this a lot in my lifetime, especially during my 25 international trips since 2007, in my trips to 37 of the 50 US states, and in my everyday goings and comings right here in Columbus and on the Ohio State University campus. It has changed my life. And doing this, I cannot unsee what I've seen, nor can I forget those I've met. As a result of all these experiences that have been very deliberate, very intentional, I always have something or someone to celebrate. So I implore each of you to spend some time with yourself, just alone, some quiet and still time alone, and reflect on how we've come together as a nation, as weavers. And as a democratic nation, we must hold on to the hope, despite how things may look today for some of us. Hold on to the hope that the US Constitution and all 50 of the state constitutions will someday be equally applied to all people, especially Black, Indigenous people of color. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of reasons why a lot of people are not in the mood to be weavers. I get it. People are sometimes not in the mood right now to be in the forgiveness mode. Talk about reconciliation or unity. But one thing I've learned about this country and history has taught us that working together is the only way to defeat tyranny, to depose evil leaders, to fight oppression, and to come together. So I end with this question. What will you do personally and professionally to become a weaver of diversity, equity, and inclusion in 2021? And as poet laureate Amanda Gordon said in her speech yesterday at the inauguration, history has its eyes on us, and your mirror has eyes on you. So do you choose to be a weaver? I hope that you do. Thank you. I'm going to pass it on to Robert Soto.
Hi, everyone. My name is Robert Soto Jr. I am a Hispanic first-generation student here at Ohio State, and I was raised in Youngstown, Ohio. Before I was asked to speak today, I had never heard of the term weaving, and when I read the meaning, I knew it was something that I resonated with immediately. Life has taken me all over the place, from adopting new siblings into my family and being a role model for them, and also to dealing with the adversities of adulthood. I, like many of you, use these three characteristics to help lead and weave my communities together. And they are curiosity, empathy, and trust. The first one, curiosity. You must be curious. My experience has shown me that asking someone a question can be the beginning of a new friendship or a new relationship or even a new business venture. It can be as simple as asking, what music are you listening to as complex as asking someone about their life story. Either way, you show that you are interested in what someone has going on in their life, and that type of interest makes people feel comfortable, important, and included. Asking thoughtful questions will lead to thoughtful answers. Number two, empathy. As humans, we all go through the same emotions, but we just experience them in different forms. It is important to try to feel the feelings of the people around you and always try to put yourself in someone else's shoes. I find that this helps. This method keeps me grounded and allows me to learn and grow with every person that I meet. I find it interesting how much I have learned from people that do not look, act, speak, or think like me. Taking the initiative to learn why members of your community feel the way that they feel is the stepping stone to a more inclusive society. Number three, trust. Now imagine this, guys. You want to go on a vacation, but you can't take your dog with you. Who can you trust with the keys to your house? Who can you trust with the well-being of a loved one? I'd imagine if I'd imagine if you come from I'd imagine some of you come from communities where you have the trust to ask a fellow neighbor or family friend to help with that. But as a first gen college student coming from an inner city, I was taught not to trust my community. My parents did their best to shield me from the world because they knew that distrusting people was safer than to risk them hurting you. So when I came to campus and I saw hundreds of people at once, all around me that I wasn't used to seeing, that I didn't know how to talk to or trust, I shut down. Trust is the basis of all relationships, and we must find a way to trust each other in order to progress through this life. Using curiosity, empathy, and trust, I weave together my communities, doing my best to keep an open mind, but also staying true to myself and the values that I hold. I think that this year has shown us that individuals nowadays are working towards individual goals, and that's still important. But I believe that in order to create an inclusive community, we must weave together our strengths, weaknesses, colors, and ideas, and all work towards a common goal. Thank you. I'll pass it on to Terry now.
Thank you so much, Jacqueline and Robert. And again, hi, everyone. My name is Terry. And I want to offer a story as a visual of a strategy called cross-stitching. It's a cold, dark Friday night, and I'm tired, and I'm on my way home from work. There's tension in the air. Drivers are aggressive, horns are honking. Everyone just wants to get home. Slightly irritated and irritable, I walk through Kroger's, not paying much attention to anything or anyone. I just want to get in there, grab something, and head on home. As I'm in the line to check out, wouldn't you know it, but in the next checkout lane over, there is a screaming kid. He's clearly unhappy. And as I glance over to see what's going on, it's clear his mother is unhappy too. So I just kind of turn back around, go about what I'm doing, pay, grab my bag, and I head toward the door. And I noticed that right in front of me, because it was hard to notice, that there's that still tantruming little boy and his mom. They're just a few steps ahead of me. She passes on through the automatic door, trying her best to keep hold of this kid while pushing this heavy, heavy cart of groceries. By now, I'm nearly next to her, and I see that not only does she have a heavy cart of groceries and this kid who's out of control, but there's an infant inside the cart seat and also a little 2-year-old sitting inside the cart with all those bags of food. I begin to see her differently, and my concern for her begins to intensify. Just as she begins to make her way across the pedestrian strip into that dark parking lot, the little boy jerks free and he screams, "I hate you." And he starts running wildly into that parking lot. Stunned and completely freaked out, she freezes. There is so much tension and aggression in that parking lot, and there is absolutely no way any driver that's backing out is going to see that little boy. I walk up to her and I say, "Just keep going. Make your way to your car. I'm going to see if I can go find your son, and I'll bring him to you." So off I go, looking for a little boy in a red hoodie in a dark parking lot. But I'm worried Because what if I scare him? He doesn't know me, and he darts off in a different direction. So as I'm making my way toward him, I do a quick survey of the horizon line. And do you know what I see? I see at least 12 other people in that parking lot, also looking at that little boy. It was as if a large circular fishing net had been thrown around the perimeter of that child. Intuitively, instinctively, and without hesitation, we had created an intersecting, interconnected, cross-connecting loop that we were holding taut, sharing the burden of what sat so vulnerably between us. We had recognized ourselves in that mother, and we had recognized ourselves in that child. A silent, instantly woven web of relationships had threaded, surrounded, and supported that little one. We slowly tightened the perimeter to ensure his safety until finally one of us was able to hoist him up and carry him over to his mommy. And then in an instant, our circle dissipated. It was gone. We slipped back into our lives, unnamed, unnoticed. Quick comments. I do believe conflict can polarize, and it certainly divides. And what it does is it pulls us apart physically, spatially, emotionally, spiritually, and it empties out a center. And as Yeats says, then the center cannot hold. So I want to think, how do we create, sustain, and maintain a center, maintain the resilience, the elasticity of our relationships, something that's strong and complex. And I think a key pathway is to cross-stitch, to intentionally weave relationships, social institutions, and processes that can manage those shocks, can manage the setbacks, can rebound, and can overcome insecurity and invulnerability. And we do this intentionally by stitching together relationships with different identities, different positionalities, different perspectives, differences. And we do that around celebrations, problem solving, designing, challenging, opportunities, learning, planning. We make sure that those relationships are surprising, not predictable, because we need to ensure relational complexity, because that's going to help the process, help us absorb shocks, flex, adjust. So we loop, we group, we tack back and forth. We group, we regroup again. And in this way, if some of the threads in that fabric of our institutions, our relationships, our families, our societies snap, the rest of what has been cross-stitched together, woven together, can adapt and can hold, because we have built relational elasticity, a relational system that is agile and able to compensate during fragile and insecure times. Over to you, Henry.
Those were some excellent comments from Vice Provost Michamaya, Robert, and Dr. Murphy. We will wrap up today's segment with 3 more presentations. Professor Sarah Cole, the Moritz College of Law's Moritz Chair in Alternative Dispute Resolution, will begin our final group of speakers addressing the value of mediation and difficult conversations, and why we might become compassionate questioners as we seek to weave. Adesh Lupsetwar, our final student speaker, is a junior triple major in economics, international relations, and diplomacy in Spanish. He will urge us to reframe our thinking to illustrate why our democracy will not work for anyone until it works for everyone. And finally, Athletic Director Gene Smith concludes our quick talks on weaving with remarks about how to model and remind others of the strength of joining with people from different talents and experiences. Professor Cole, let's hear from you.
Thank you so much, Henry. Each year, I'm fortunate to teach the mediation clinic here at the Moritz College of Law. Our students mediate cases in Franklin County's small claims court. Teaching mediation is a very rewarding experience, not only because I observe students improving their skills as mediators, but because of the opportunity they often have to watch the impact of a facilitative dispute resolution process on the parties. One semester, I watched two of our students handle what seemed like an ordinary dispute between cousins who used to live together about a failure to pay rent. The party who hadn't paid rent was also an hour late to the mediation. Not a great start. The student mediators asked each side for their perspective, and as they implemented various mediation techniques like active listening, asking for issues, and setting an agenda, the transformative part of the mediation really began. The person who was owed rent described in unrelenting detail the consequences that occurred to her when her cousin failed to pay the rent. She was evicted from the apartment, lost many of her personal belongings, and had to move to a homeless shelter where she was bitten by bed bugs and urinated on by a fellow resident. Hearing her story was truly heartbreaking, but what was transformative and cathartic was the cousin's reaction. It was clear he'd blithely gone on his way, not considering the effect his failure to pay rent would have on his cousin. With tears in his voice, he agreed to pay the back rent and, of course, apologized for his behavior. Mediation and other facilitative processes have the power to transform the facilitator, the parties, and anyone else who's fortunate enough to be in the room. Learning facilitation and mediation skills enhances the facilitator's capacity for listening effectively, experiencing and demonstrating empathy, teaching and learning effective negotiation skills, and developing both their own and the party's emotional intelligence. In our divided world, learning to listen actively and put aside one's own biases and feelings and really listen and demonstrate to the people you are listening to that you are listening are essential skills if we ever hope to have greater unity in this country. The ability to reframe language so that it doesn't incite while allowing parties to vent their emotions are other skills mediators learn and teach throughout a mediation process. In addition, the mediator demonstrates and develops their own ability to empathize and to teach others to negotiate productively. And the experience of mediation creates an opportunity for participants to recapture the sense of agency that conflict compromises. Development of these skills and participation in the processes where they can be applied can only further the important endeavor of improving understanding. At a time when many are skeptical of the ability to achieve any sort of unity, learning and using the skills of a mediator, which anyone can do, hopefully will move the needle towards greater understanding and perhaps weaving together disparate views, even if only a few people at a time. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it to Adesh.
Thank you, Professor Cole. In April of 2018, the Texas education system was under scrutiny for trying to encourage students to think about the pros and cons of American historical figures, events, and institutions. On face value, it sounds like those schools were doing the right thing, trying to create well-rounded students who weigh both sides of an argument. But when you do your homework, you'll find out that those students were supposed to look at the pros and cons of slavery. So you would see two lists. On the negatives of slavery, there was forced labor, rape, imposed religion, stolen culture, torture of Black and brown bodies, physical and mental abuse, no representation, separated families, and scientific racism. And the positives? To help the economy or protect state rights. The school issued a statement that they do not endorse that worksheet and apologize to the community. But this case is not an issue of encouraging students to think critically or even learn about history. The problem stems from giving two views equal weight when they don't have equal merit. Forcing some value to both sides of an argument has its limits. The social fabric begins to fray when discourse begins to excuse everything. It may sound counterintuitive, but not every idea nor opinion needs to be understood, disseminated, valued, or validated, especially when the hostile and destructive opinion directly harms someone. At some point, balanced perspectives can be far more detrimental than helpful. We saw this on January 6th. The attempted insurrection at the Capitol was unprecedented, but not unpredictable. American historians explain that the insurgents could have been foreseen and even prevented, but the plans to storm the Capitol were never shut down. Across multiple communication and social media platforms, the effort to preserve hateful speech and defamation to seem balanced and equitable proved to catalyze the destruction in Washington, D.C. Giving credence to the baseless idea that the election was fraudulent or rigged was enough to push violent words into violent actions. Once again, this is an issue of inequity and injustice. If the United States is supposed to champion democracy, it must be reminded that democracy does not work for anyone if it does not work for everyone. To be truly democratic, to be just and fair, we should weave divided communities by fixing the way we frame education. It is easy to think critically without needing to balance two unequal perspectives. Instead, teach about trends in history, how historical tragedies could have been prevented and solved, and how history often repeats itself. It may be difficult to have those conversations and conceive certain moral or ethical absolutes, but they will ultimately pay off. Americans need to lean into this discomfort. It is uncomfortable to learn about these atrocities in American history, but it is even more uncomfortable to be the Black student who has to hear his peers justify slavery. And it is more uncomfortable to argue for the sake of arguing. Sometimes it really is better to be off balance on purpose. Thank you. And I'll now pass it on to Gene Smith.
Thank you, Adesh, and let me thank everyone for being with us this evening. I appreciate everyone taking the time on this very important topic. I've learned through reading leadership books and experiences, particularly Stephen Covey, one of my favorite writers, that strength lies in differences, not similarities. In your athletic department, our leadership team is comprised of women and men of varying ages, ethnicities, experiences, religions, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And the strength of your team is that we often see things through the lens of our unique and varied experiences. And that ultimately allows us to make thoughtful and informed decisions. We embrace the fact that diversity is a business imperative and has been a key ingredient for our long-term success. We create a culture wherein we have open and honest communications, respect for others' opinions and thoughts. The blessing that we have is that we do this naturally in the environment with the students we serve. Let me give you an example, and it ties a little bit to what Dr. Murphy was sharing earlier relative to cross-stitching. Because if we were not able to bring the diversity of our football team together last fall, young men from different walks of life, rural environments, urban environments, private schools, Catholic schools, public schools, socioeconomic backgrounds that are totally different races, religions, all across the country. You take our offensive line. We had a player who was raised part of his life by legal guardians, playing next to a potential Rhodes Scholar, majoring in engineering, playing next to an outdoorsman who loves to hunt, playing next to a free-spirited Californian whose grandfather was a Hall of Fame football player, playing next to a young man from Florida who's mostly introverted. We ask those young men to come together, execute 80, 85 plays a game, and bring in a young man who was a graduate transfer and compete in the game for the Big Ten championship and run 331 yards and break a 25-year record that was held by a former Heisman Trophy winner. We ask all of them to set their differences aside and respect one another's differences. Come together towards one common goal: defeat your opponent. Every day in life, we should be doing this in every single thing we do. We need to embrace diversity of thought and opinion. And in so doing, show the respect that diversity and thought and opinion deserves. We all have different views in life because we're the total sum of our experiences in life. And ultimately, that is the asset that we all need to embrace. That is why organizations and corporations who are so successful thrive, because they create a culture and environment where that openness and that honesty and that freewheeling of communication can be cross-stitched, as Dr. Murphy shared, and ultimately strengthen the organization in a way that strengthens the individuals who make up the organization. Through the eyes of others, we see ourselves. And if we cannot create an environment where the lens that we all look through allows us to grow and see our blind spots, it's very difficult for the organizations, the corporations, or the individual to be successful. We're blessed in our society. We really are. And what we need to do is recognize that blessing. We do every single day in trying to run your athletic department. We understand the conversations that go on in the locker rooms about all the issues that we faced in 2020. We know our football players, for example, have those debates in the locker room, but they walk out of that locker room and they come together as Buckeyes to represent themselves, their families, and the Ohio State University towards one common goal: to overcome their opponent. And to me, in my view, this is a great opportunity, a great time for us to understand what it means to weave, what it means to cross-stitch, as Dr. Murphy shared. To me, this is a time for us to embrace one another, to embrace our differences, be open to our differences, listen to the differences, and respect those. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'll turn it over to Bill and Carl.
Thank you, Director Smith. What a great set of presentations. I hope you have a few ideas in mind for weaving in your own communities. Please keep writing down ideas as we continue this evening's session, and feel free to add your questions and comments in the Q&A function.
Julia and I appreciated everyone's engagement with tonight's quick talks. And before we transition to facilitated conversation with the Divided Community Project leadership, we want to urge you to respond to this short poll. What is the most significant pressure tearing at the fabric of the community where you are watching the session? Now, let's turn it over to Divided Community Project co-director Carl Smallwood and Deputy Director Bill Froelich. They'll try to address some of your questions and comments while they engage in this evening's speakers.
Thank you, Henry and Julia. I'm Carl Smallwood. I'm a co-director of the Divided Community Project, and Bill Froelich is with me. He's the deputy director. And what we intended to do initially was to have a facilitated discussion, but our schedule is such with our speaker coming that we have, I think, about 7 minutes before we get to the next highlight of this program. And so what Bill and I will try to do in the next few minutes, while you may be thinking some more about how you might weave, even before you hear David Brooks, Bill and I will address one or two of the questions perhaps and give you some observations. I want to thank all of our speakers who were absolutely wonderful this evening. Bill?
Well, thank you, Carl. I really appreciate the reminder that history has its eyes on all of us right now. And thanks for that inspiration from Amanda Gorman yesterday afternoon. If you haven't seen her inspirational remarks, I urge you to take a look. One person in the chat function commented that it takes one person at a time, that we need to build weavers one at a time. And that's right. Weaving is relational. It's about finding depth within our relationships, getting to know folks on a personal level, getting to understand them, training, as Professor Cole said, 1 or 2 mediators at a time in small cohorts. We become weavers by shifting one little bit at a time, our view from one that's self-absorbed and focused on ourselves to a relational perspective that's focused on others and focused on caring for and learning about others. So I encourage you to keep thinking about how you're going to shift your perspective and become more of a weaver. I want to ask now just a couple of questions before we introduce Mr. Brooks. And what struck me here is how many have picked up on Professor Murphy's cross-stitching theme that she mentioned. So Carl, I wanted to ask you and perhaps Terry, how to maintain the center of a conversation, as Professor Murphy described, when issues are implicated by institutional racism. How can we maintain the center of that conversation when, as Lena Tenney described, that individuals have a knife in their back 9 inches, but it's only been pulled out 6? How do we maintain that center and the elasticity?
Well, I'll go first while Terry's probably unmuting herself. And I thought, Robert Soto addressed it very well by suggesting that curiosity, empathy, and trust can take us a long way towards listening and building empathy and trying to create a connection to understand. There's a question in the chat function about do we cancel opposing views? I mean, all views don't have the same value. We understand that, but if they are held by others, Robert's admonition that we ought to be curious about why it is so, to be empathetic enough to perhaps try to understand why that person thinks it is so, and to perhaps trust intention and see if you can get to then a deeper conversation to make progress, is a wonderful place to start. Terry?
Thanks, Carl. Much of the areas in the world where I have worked, the cross-stitching is after the fact. I think cross-stitching is a wonderful preventative model, but it also is an important model when in post-war, post-conflict, or conflict-affected spaces. So I worked in Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kurdistan. And I guess I would say that this isn't a fairy tale. This is really, really hard work. It's not about like the white doves. It takes incredible courage and tenacity to move into these spaces. It does for me as an individual. I think it does for people who have lived through years and years of violation and violence. It's bloody, it's messy, it's scary, but it's the work that's ahead of us. And so for me, it's about timing. I'm not always ready to be in a conversation with somebody. It's not the right time for me. Maybe I have to have some time and conversation with my own group, the intra-group kind of work. Maybe I need to be inside intergroup work for quite a while before I would even slightly imagine talking across to another group, all right? Especially when there's been disgrace, and again, when there's been humiliation, when there has been deep injustice. So there isn't a formula, Bill. I think timing is critical. I think sensitivity is important, but I think those of us that are weavers, we got to build our own rib cage, our hearts, make them strong, broad, and move towards what we can, but recognize that sometimes bringing people together isn't the right thing to do. And then other times we invite, we encourage, we hold steady, and we cast hope that this is possible. So I'm not giving you a great answer. For me, it's a lot about process and timing.
Thank you, Terry. I'm also hearing it's about knowing yourself and knowing where you are at a particular time and whether you can enter that conversation or hold space for that challenging conversation. And if you don't know where you're coming from, you shouldn't just simply engage because you think it's essential or important. You need to know that you're ready to engage in those challenging conversations. I want to turn now to Lena Tenney to jump in on this conversation. And then if we have time, we'll turn to one or two others.
Great, thanks, Bill. Yeah, one of the elements within these kind of challenging topics is that oftentimes the unspoken dynamic is that folks who are really well-intended and want to learn more, especially through personal interactions and stories, might not realize that a lot of the time the implicit assumption is that folks who have these experiences are in some way sort of like obligated to educate the rest of the folks around them, right? We see this in classrooms all the time. So one way to be aware of that as you are on your journey as a weaver and you want to learn more, curiosity is good. just be mindful of those capacity issues, that folks are not only dealing with these things, they're then having to talk about them, sometimes without any healing from the trauma, right? So just ask consent before asking questions that can be pretty personal. Like, I am pretty much always game to answer questions about my experience as someone who's non-binary. And it's really great when folks give me a heads up and proactively say, hey, can we talk about this? And I'd love to buy you coffee. Like, buy the coffee if you're going to ask the questions. And respect it if folks say, I don't have the space for that. And then for those of us who are often relied upon to share our stories, which can be really engaging and wonderful, but also tiring work, I just want to remind us of a quote that I saw on Twitter recently, which is that you are not required to light yourself on fire in order to show the other folks around you the light. So it's okay to take care of yourself and have personal boundaries, even at the same time that we are trying to stay centered on these conversations. And that could include getting a rain check and coming on back.
Well, thank you, Lena. I see that Mr. Brooks has joined us now, and I believe that he is able to deliver his remarks. So we're going to turn to Carl for a quick introduction of Mr. Brooks, and then we'll hear additional inspiration from him on weaving.
Thank you. And I see we tried to answer one or two of the questions, but there was a question in the chat room about what are the action items or what takeaways from this will be implemented in the university. And we would invite you, as you listen to David Brooks tonight and as you think about it, if you haven't already, to post an idea for the university in the chat room. We'd love to hear from you. But now to the highlight of the evening. The Divided Community Project exists to help communities address and to help communities plan to resolve conflicts that divide them. 60 years ago, during a time of division, Martin Luther King Jr. expressed that we're caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And now 21 days into 2021, our garment of destiny is weakened and frayed. Our communities and our country are deeply divided by partisan politics, by racial inequity, religion, social identity and orientation. A pandemic has caused us to be socially isolated, fearful, and fragmented. And we've built walls, figuratively and literally. And if you saw Washington in the last couple of days, I've never seen walls like that in our national capital during my lifetime. These divisions have torn at the bonds that tie us together. And that's why we're delighted this evening to conclude this session with inspirational remarks from David Brooks, a New York Times columnist, nationally known commentator, a thinker, and a founder of the Aspen Institute's Weave the Social Fabric project. Mr. Brooks expresses his vision for turning dreams into reality by calling upon weavers, people who put relationships over self. He explains, when we love across boundaries, listen patiently, see deeply, and make someone feel known, we've woven the social fabric and reinforced generosity. Mr. Brooks's vision calls for a cultural revolution that empowers us all to lead lives of greater meaning, purpose, and joy. And 4.5 million people have watched his TED Talk about his solution to the social crisis in which we find ourselves. Now, this evening, we've already heard from nearly a dozen campus leaders. And we hope, as you've listened to tonight's conversation, you've collected a number of ideas about building relationships with your neighbors to bring your community together. But now, Mr. Brooks, we're delighted to invite you to share with our audience ideas and inspiration for weaving communities together.
Thank you, Carl. It's a pleasure to be at Ohio State. I've been there for a year and a half or so. So it's a real pleasure to be back. In the brief time I have, I thought I'd put weaving and that kind of life in the context of the life that a lot of young adults are going to be entering. And I'll start with a couple of distinctions, binaries that have been useful to me. One, which came from an earlier book of mine, was the difference between the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. The resume virtues are the things that make you good at a job, and the eulogy virtues are the things they say after you're dead, whether you're honorable, courageous, compassionate, capable of great love. And sometimes our meritocratic system puts a lot of emphasis on the resume virtues, but I think we all know the eulogy virtues are more important. It's important to focus on that. The second is the difference between happiness and joy. Happiness is what you get when you feel big about yourself. Your team wins or almost wins the national championship. You go to a Super Bowl, you get a promotion at work, you get a good grade on a paper. And happiness is great, but happiness is an expansion of self. Joy is the erasure of self. Joy is when you're dancing with your friends and you're not even conscious of yourself anymore, you're just lost in it. Joy is when you're embedded in a community and you've given yourself over to the community and serving the people around you. Joy is just sitting around a dinner table with people who you've been working with. And so my rule is that happiness is good, but joy is better. And so that's a second binary. The third is the distinction between what I call the first and second mountain. The first mountain is you're building up your career, you're building up your ego, but then usually there's some crisis and you're down in the valley. And then many people have a second mountain experience where they realize they want to not have a life about ego, but a life about giving back. And so, especially for college students over the next 10 years, you're going to make 4 big commitments. And those commitments are to a family, to a vocation, to a philosophy or faith, and to a community. And the success and fulfillment of your life will depend on how well you choose and execute on those commitments. And so it's always useful to keep those ideas foremost in your mind, the big commitments, the big decisions of life. And I always think, your first year out of college, the best thing to do is to do something that widens your horizon of risk. Do something really daring, because you're never going to have a chance to do that again. And so if you embed yourself in a community to serving some part of the country you know nothing about, you'll go through the rest of your life knowing you can do that kind of stuff. And you'll go through the rest of your life aware that your moral lens is aroused. You want to serve some moral mission. And in my view, we live and are sometimes caught in a meritocracy that deadens the moral lens and makes us too individualistic. It tells us these lies that life is an individual journey. I can make myself happy. And that it's all up to us as individuals. And I can tell you, as someone who succeeded way beyond he ever thought he would, these are lies. There's this book, Dr. Seuss, The Places You'll Go. It's about some kid going on an individual journey to life towards success. He has no friends, he has no relationships, he has no family in that book. That's not the way life is. And it's certainly not the way a rich life is. And when you have a culture that is hyper-individualistic, where we see ourselves as autonomous selves, then you got to have a culture where there's loneliness. We have a culture of division. We have a culture of 30% rise in depression, 60% rise in teenage suicide. And when you leave people naked and alone, they do what their evolutionary roots tell them to do. They revert to tribe. And that's more or less what's happened in our culture. And that's more or less what we saw 2 weeks ago at the Capitol, 10 blocks from where I'm sitting, which is people were so ensavaged by tribalism, they tried to take over the Capitol building in the most horrific way possible. And so in that sense, we've become a broken society. And I think it's because we just left people naked and alone in a culture that emphasized self and individualism and de-emphasized some of the things that are more important, that turned off the moral lens. There was an Israeli daycare center that had a problem that the parents were coming in late to pick up their kids and the teachers couldn't go home. So the daycare center imposed fines on the parents. And the number of parents who came in late after the fines were imposed doubled. And that's because what had been a moral decision to show up on time so the teachers could go home was turned into an economic decision. They were happy to pay the fine if they could have another hour or two before picking up their kids. And that's what our culture does a lot. It turns off the moral lens and it turns on the economic lens. And so I met and have now worked with through Weave, a group of people who have turned on the moral lens. A woman I know in Chicago, in a neighborhood called Englewood, is named Aisha Butler. Englewood's a tough neighborhood in Chicago, and Aisha was going to leave because she had a 9-year-old daughter. She was concerned about violence. And just before she was going to move, she'd already had the barbecue to say goodbye to her neighbors. She looked across at an empty lot, and she saw a little girl in a pink dress playing with broken bottles in an empty lot. She turns to her husband and says, "We're not going to leave. We're not going to be just another family that left this." And so she doesn't know what to do. She Googles volunteer in Englewood. And one thing leads to another. And over the next several years, she now runs something called RAGE, which is the big community organization in Englewood that cleans up empty lots. And so, and now if you go to Englewood, if you go to the stores, there are t-shirts for sale, and it'll say "Proud son of Englewood," "Proud daughter of Englewood." And so that's someone who devoted their life to this kind of community building, this kind of service. I have a friend, Sarah Atkins, and this is something terrible happened to her, the worst thing that can possibly happen. She came home one day and she found that her husband had killed their kids and himself. And now she lives a life of service. She's a pharmacist. She has a free pharmacy. She teaches at Ohio University. She said, "I did it because I'm angry. He wanted to erase me. I wanted to show him I was going to make a difference in the world." And so she now lives a life of giving back and community building. Some people had horrible things happen to them, and they want to make sure it didn't happen to other people. Some people just were surrounded and with a certain form of community, and they always felt that way. I'm part of a community called AOK, which is about 20 or 30 DC kids. And it was really headed by a woman named Kathy Fletcher. And Kathy just grew up in a big Irish Catholic family, and she was used to having lots of people around. And so starting about 4 years ago, went over to their house, and there were 25 kids sitting around the dinner table. It was just kids would come in who wanted a place to stay, wanted dinner, and she would host them every Thursday night. And they became really an extended family for several years. And it was a very huggy, touchy place. I went in my first day, this was like 6 years ago, and I put out my hand to shake a kid's hand. He says, "We don't really shake hands here, we just hug here." And they created this atmosphere, and I'm not the huggiest guy in the world, but they created an atmosphere where hugging was the thing to do. And so I want to stay in the community, so I adapted. And so these are weavers. And weavers have an ethos which is not all about individualism. It's not all about autonomy. They believe in a sort of a moral commitment. They have vocational certitude. I've never met one who said, "I'm going to do this, serve my community for a little while, and then I'm going to give up." They have a sense of, they know why they were planted on this earth. And so when I see them, they're just the most relational people. They have the capacity to see others and to see them deeply. I was having breakfast at a diner in Waco, and I was with this formidable 93-year-old lady who was the strict disciplinarian, the head of her school district. And she intimidated the hell out of me. She was like a Marine drill sergeant. She said, "I love my children enough to discipline them." And she was so tough-minded and tough. And I was scared of her a little. And a friend of ours, named Jimmy Durrell, who runs something called Mission Waco, where he wanted the homeless people wouldn't come to his church. So he took his church to an underpass, a highway underpass, and he brought the church to the homeless. He took it to the place where the homeless sleep. And he came in and happened to see this woman, Mrs. Dorsey, at the diner, and he grabbed her by the shoulders and shook her way harder than you should shake any 93-year-old. And he peered into her eyes and he said, Mrs. Dorsey, I love you, you're the best, you're the best." And this stern look suddenly dissolved, and she was a 9-year-old woman, a 9-year-old girl. Suddenly she turned into a little girl. And so these people that I've described have really led heroic lives, sometimes really sacrificing. You don't have to do that. Maybe you're called to do that. But you can invite your neighbor over for dinner. You can create a little weekly discussion group. You can go to someplace, a needy community that you know nothing about, and just say, "How can I help?" And so to me, that is the lesson here, that these little acts lead to big changes. We can't change the world all at once, but we can shift norms. We can shift what we think, how we think we should behave. The Me Too movement shifted norms. Black Lives Matter shifts norms. Environmental movement shifts norms. How do we think we should behave? And the culture changes when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy them. And in my view, these weavers have found a better way to live. And if we copy them a little more relational, a little more communal in our daily lives, then the culture will shift in a big way. And so it's an honor to be part of what you're doing. And I salute you for doing what you're doing, and pray for you and wish you all the best.
What a delight, Mr. Brooks. So inspirational. If we can all take just little steps to be more like the weavers you described, hopefully our community, our university community, and the communities where we live will just be a little bit better. And we can model those skills for others. Thank you so much for joining us this evening and providing this inspiration to the hundreds of folks, hundreds of Buckeyes on this call, and to the hundreds who I'm sure will watch it on YouTube in a few days. Carl, did you want to add something?
No, thank you so much, Mr. Brooks. Really appreciate it, and for making the point so clearly that all it takes is a heart to serve. It doesn't take other special skills. So thank you so much for spending some time with us this evening. And we heard from some weavers in the Buckeye community, and we're hoping to hear from a few more before we end this program tonight. And at some point you should check back in with us and see how we're doing.
I will. I'm honored to be a part of this. So thanks so much for the invitation.
Thanks for all that you do. Well, it falls to me to close after the inspirational remarks somehow. And I just want to again thank Mr. Brooks and thank President Johnson, along with our 9 speakers this evening. James, David, Lena, Terry, Robert, Jacqueline, Sarah, Adesh, and Jean. It's been a delight to be on this session with all of you, including our facilitators, Carl, myself, and Henry, and Julia. Before we close tonight, you'll recall at the beginning of the session, Henry and Julia asked you to take a few notes about ways in which you might weave in the weeks and days ahead. So we wanted to invite you now, after hearing from 15 people, believe it or not, in 70 some minutes, we wanted to invite you to share with us how you will weave using the chat function. We wanted to invite you to write how you will weave in the chat function and share it with the Ohio State community. It could be as simple as reaching out to a neighbor, or it could be as dynamic as taking your gifts and skills to those who need them, like the church under the bridge and the community as Mr. Brooks described. As you make your public commitments, we want to thank you all again for joining us this evening. And wherever you are around the world, we hope you, our viewers, have collected a number of these ideas to build relationships across your communities and with your neighbors, to take a relational view that puts the world and others over oneself. It's clear that many of you have made commitments to weave already. And as we conclude, I might share some. But I just want to thank you all one more time and remind you that next week there's another event in this series. And I believe there'll be a slide shown in just 1 second. There are many who have typed into the chat function. Some are committing to endeavoring to talk versus defend those on social media I disagree with. So find a way to talk, to build strength and start an intergroup relationship, to reach out to friends in the other spectrum of the political arena to understand what they believe. Remembering to ask others if they have the space for a difficult conversation. These are just some of the ideas that are flowing in. And Mr. Brooks, I see you're still on, so if you have a final remark for us, we'd be delighted to hear it before we conclude for the evening.
The only quick thing I'll say is one of the things weavers tend to have is a technology for convening. Some way to get people together. It can be a dinner table. It can be, there's a group called Becoming a Man in Chicago they do a check-in where they check in. How are you doing emotionally, spiritually, psychologically? intellectually, and they do it with gang members. So they're super armored up, but the technology, just a method for getting people talking, and just find a method, and then the rest will follow. And what Carl said, you don't need the skills. You start with just knowing you have to be there, and the skills will come later.
Well, thank you, Mr. Brooks, one more time. Unfortunately, our session for this session has come to a close, but I thank you all for joining us, and thanks again to Mr. Brooks, President Johnson, and our speakers this evening. Hope you have a good night, and good luck weaving.